Young people stand up, work up, stand up. Africa stand up, don't learn from Africa.
Not so long ago, not more than 2 months to be exact, I, like many, read and watched the news. And it was not lost on me that within a period of only several months, the African leaders had been invited to Beijing in China. And not so long after that, the Chancellor of Germany was in Africa. And immediately after that, the French president was in Africa. And immediately after that, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was in Africa. And immediately after that, the President of China was in Africa, so that Africa became some kind of political and economic mecca, giving meaning to these words, that if the mountain cannot go to Muhammad, Muhammad will go to the mountain. Which begs the question, what is it in Africa that people seek? And how must Africa respond to the world in this environment? Many will say that the problems, if any, of Africa have been analyzed and perhaps overanalyzed, and we no longer need to paralyze ourselves through analysis. And it behooves us to make prescriptions on how we should grow Africa. There is merit in such arguments that we now pretty much know what Africa needs. And indeed, what Africa needs has always been known. And the most eloquent articulation of what Africa ought to do in order to realize our potential was articulated in 1963. I remind my audience, perhaps ad nauseum, that in 1963, regardless of who had colonized who, when the 32 African leaders met in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in the month of May 1963, it mattered not who was speaking, whether it was Houphouët Boigny of Côte d'Ivoire, or Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, or it was Amadou Ahidjo, who then made sense of the Cameroon, or David Dacko of Central African Republic, or Haile Selassie of Ethiopia, or Nyerere of Tanganyika. Then they were unanimous and clear in their mind that for Africa to realize our potential, Africa had to unite. But they were not naive. They were not naive in assuming that unity meant unanimity. They were not naive in assuming that when they talked about unity, they did not appreciate the diversity of Africa. They were clear in their minds that our diversity was our strength, and that that diversity need not be defined by others. They were alive to the fact that in our diversity, we had been placed in pigeonholes and gridlocked by our erstwhile colonial powers, and that therefore those who had been colonized by the Portuguese found themselves being described by politicians and historians and indeed anthropologists as Lusophones in an attempt to pigeonhole them and to create a chasm between them and their African brethren. They were alive to the fact that through the process of assimilation, those who had been colonized by the French were being told that your ancestors were the Gauls and that they had been pigeonholed, and a chasm was created between them and their brethren, being told that you ought to gravitate towards Paris, and that those who had been colonized by the British were also being reminded that they were Anglophones, And that therefore, in their clarity of mind and in their vision, and I dare say, perhaps in a manner that is hyperbolic, that Kwame Nkrumah was or had the vision of a Jewish prophet, even without the gift. Why do I say so? He was able to recognize that if Africans did not deal with the fundamental issues in those very embryonic days, there was a danger that the erstwhile colonial power would use both subtle and indeed pernicious means to ensure that Africans were divided. How right they were. How right they were. That the dividends of independence did not come in the torrents that we had expected. Because what did we expect independence to give us? We expected that upon acquisition, if you may, or upon regaining our independence, our dignity would be restored. Because that indeed was the fountain from which our very being would be underlined and given her pride of place. The entire process of colonization was also a process of dehumanization. And the leaders of the day were clear that when we regain our independence, then we would be able to do things for ourselves, that we would be able to interact with other civilizations on an equal footing, that we would be able to create education systems that would be relevant to our people, that we would be able to grow our own food, that we would be able to exploit our resources in a manner that would be beneficial to us, that we would be able to do things that would be for the general good and the benefit of the peoples. And it is instructive that at that time when we were regaining our independence, the world was schizophrenic in many ways. And when I use the word schizophrenia, I'm using it as a term of art. It is always remembered that important to remember that in 1945, when the entire continent of Africa was under the yoke of colonization, except for Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Ethiopia, the world was sitting in San Francisco and telling ourselves that all men are born equal. It is instructive that 3 years later in Paris, France, in the year of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is the same year that Hendrik Verwoerd was creating the apartheid government in South Africa and saying that Africans were fit to be drawers of water and hewers of wood. So that schizophrenia of the world saying one thing with one side of the mouth and another with the other side, saying with its mouth what it did not believe in her head, is what defines how we are today. So that Africa still finds herself punching below her political weight, punching below her economic weight, punching below her weight generally, great in prospect, but not in fact, which makes others think that Africa cannot be great. But I do not belong to that school, and we must never belong to that school, because the school that must carry the day is the school that tells us that Africa's better days are in front of her, and that Africa will be great. But it will not be great because of the number of speeches that we make or the pronouncements that we make or that we engage in prayer and fasting. Africa will be great if our sons and daughters are able to recognize what is in their best interest and they begin to engage in a constructive manner regardless of where they are. You know, when I look at some of the activities of the sons and daughters of Africa in the early 19th century, and I look at it in an environment where there were no aeroplanes, I look at it in an environment where there were no mobile phones, I look at it in an environment where the challenges of communication were obvious and indeed debilitating. Yet in the face of those difficulties, it was possible for Jamaica's Marcus Garvey to see that the salvation of the African people required, and if it did not require, demanded that they must work together. What vision in those early days. Yet, in those days, I can still hear the words of a man who is not mentioned as often as he should be. South Africa, speaking Kaisa Kaseme, speaking in 1906 here in the United States of America, and saying that Africa must be regenerated. I can still hear the many beautiful speeches of W.B. Du Bois, recognizing that the African Americans, even in those days, had to collaborate with their brethren in the mother continent. I can hear, even in those early days, the words of Martin Luther King Jr., and even the unguarded speeches of Malcolm X, telling us that our success not only required but demanded that we work together. I can hear on that day of the independence of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah says that the independence of Ghana means nothing if the rest of Africa is not free. The question is, we who are their successors, are we truly their successors by word and deed? Have we, as was expected of them, embraced the philosophy? If Kwame were to speak in 1957, would he have been right in saying, as Nigeria's Chinua Achebe once famously wrote in his book, Things Fall Apart, that we are the young suckers who would grow when the old bananas die? These are the questions that we must ask ourselves. And one can even see that it was not only in the political arena, because many times it is the tendency of many of us who have the opportunity to analyze these things, to think that activities that define our very being is to be found only in politics. When Harper Lee was writing To Kill a Mockingbird, could she have been speaking to us? When Jody Graft was writing his famous play Muntu, could he have been speaking to us? When Gabriel Okara was writing his book The Voice, could he have been speaking to us? When Cyprian Ekwensi was writing The Burning Grass, could he have been speaking to us? When Flora Nwapa was writing Efuru, could she have been speaking to us? When Peter Abrahams was writing his book The Mine Boy, could he have been speaking to us? When Alan Patton was writing Cry the Beloved Country, could he have been speaking to us? When Athol Fugard was writing Blood Knot, could he have been speaking to us? And my view is that we have been spoken to in many ways, through different avenues. And it is not time for sorrows and lamentations, but time for us to ask ourselves what it is that we can do. The Africans in Jamaica, the Africans in Guyana, the Africans in Trinidad and Tobago, the Africans in Barbuda, the Africans in Suriname, the Africans in St. Kitts and Nevis, the Africans in the continent of the United States of America, the Africans in Brazil, in Honduras, the Africans everywhere. Is it not wise that we must now begin to redefine the manner in which we relate? Because how can it be? How can it be that a continent which is the richest continent on earth is the poorest continent on earth? How can it be that the Democratic Republic of Congo, which is perhaps the richest mineral resource country on earth, is the incubator of all unimaginable diseases. If it is not HIV debilitating, it is Ebola. How can it be? The truth is, as long as we remain disorganized, as long as the African American still thinks that they are from mother continent, but they do not want to come in the mother continent, we are not going to use our energies as we should. You know, there is a little country from which Africans can learn. This little country had her sons and daughters dispersed throughout the world. Some are to be found in North Africa, some are to be found in Europe, some are to be found in Latin America, some are to be found in the United States. This little country had 6 million of our sons and daughters killed by Adolf Hitler. This little country is no bigger than the state of Maryland. This little country was created in 1948. This little country today is a heavyweight in technological affairs. This little country is Israel. That little country gives us education which we can learn from. If the 1.5 billion of us, regardless of wherever we are, were to make a decision and a deliberate decision that we can now begin to work together to reinvigorate the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr., of W.E.B. Du Bois in the early 1960s, and make Africa the Mecca to which we congregate for our political affairs, for our economic affairs, to celebrate our diversity, you can begin to imagine what we can do. You can begin to imagine what we can do to ourselves. You know, sometimes when one travels, one is confronted with apparently innocuous things, but they are very telling. If you visit any typical airport in Europe, 6 out of 10 times, the treatment that is meted against you, however subtle it is defined by the weakness of your mother continent. So that when you are talking about the most powerful passports on earth, there is not a single African country that is described as powerful. But yet I believe that if African countries could come together, and I'm not naive in suggesting, as I said a little earlier, that coming together means that we are unanimous about everything and that we are not diverse. That is not what I mean. What I mean is that our coming together must be based on our realization and recognition that we must emphasize more the things that unite us and de-emphasize the things that are likely to divide us. And that can be done, that has been done. The European Union has also demonstrated to us that you can run an organization that operates on the basis of 27 languages, but identify things that allow us to realize our potential. And when I look at us, I think that we have those possibilities. And those possibilities have been identified. The African Union does not speak as eloquently and as loudly as it ought to be, and in my view does not speak as articulately as it ought to do on its Agenda 2063. I always remember that in the month of May, if it is the year 2013, the year when Africa Agenda 2063 came into being, the then chair of the African Union, Kosan Dlamini Zuma, read what she said, and indeed it was a fictional letter to Kwame Nkrumah, saying in effect and telling Kwame, if indeed we, the African, lost the first 50 years after we regained our independence, we are not just about to lose another 50 years. We are going to ensure that by the year 2020, all the guns are silent in Africa. We are going to ensure that by the year 2025, all the pernicious foreign interference will not be allowed to have their pride of place in Africa. We are going to ensure that we have the equivalent of a Silicon Valley in Africa. We are going to ensure that we have an environment in Africa. We are going to ensure that we have education that addresses and informs our very well-being in Africa. We are going to ensure that we have medical facilities so that when our men and women are sick, they don't go to other civilizations. We are going to produce our own food. One can say that that is promising El Dorado, which will never come, but I think not. I hold the view that we have the intellectual wherewithal to achieve that. I hold the view that we have the ability to achieve that. And that to me is where the diaspora comes. You may not be Christian, some of you may be Muslim, but allow me to use this analogy to be found in the Christian Bible. The story of the sons of a Jewish patriarch, one of them called Joseph, who was sold into slavery and sojourned in Egypt. And there is a sense in which you Africans in the diaspora are like Joseph. You have come to a land and you have given ideas to this land and these lands in which you sojourn. When we come to you as Africans from the mother continent, we are coming to you because we believe that it is in the combination of our efforts and the cross-fertilization of our ideas that we can indeed be in a position to make our mother continent great. But let you not be cheated, but because sometimes in the process of analyzing the African problem, many times we speak as if nothing good is happening in Africa. False. There are many things that are happening in Africa which are good, but we never speak about them. Amen. We never speak about them because we never tell our story. Our story has always been told by others. And Chinua Achebe and Wole Soyinka were right. As long as the lions do not have their historians, it is always the exploits of the hunters that will be spoken about, not the bravery of the lion. But I'm submitting to us that time has come that we must begin to tell our story. Every civilization tells her story. The Arabs tell their stories through Al Jazeera. The British tell their stories through BBC. The Germans tell their stories through Deutsche Welle. The Americans will tell their story through CNN and Fox. The French tell their story through Radio France. The Africans must begin to tell their story from their perspective. And I believe that we have men and women in this continent and in other parts of the continent who are already beginning to do that. Let you not be cheated. You know, it may be argued that we never went through the classical industrial revolution, but there is now a fourth industrial revolution. And I am certain that we will not be left out. The power of the medium that we now have will enable the Africans to tell their stories. But I was talking about good things that are happening in Africa. There are good things. If you go to the country of Ethiopia, there are good things that are happening there. You know, I remember so very vividly in the 1980 when a British musician held a concert. He was called Bob Geldof. And the only thing that he told the world is that the Ethiopians were dying because they were hungry. And we believed then that some musician could hold a concert, and when that concert had been held, then the Ethiopians would be fed. The Ethiopians recognized that that is not the avenue. Today you go to Ethiopia and you see what they are doing in terms of installing electricity. You go to Addis Ababa, they will always have their problems. The Ethiopians are now saying that we are going to roast our own coffee. The Ethiopians are now saying that we are going to work our own leather. The Ethiopians are now saying that we are going to run our own airline, and they are doing a good job of it. We can do it. And it is not only Ethiopia that is working. In 1966, when Botswana regained independence, she was only famous for a number of things, that there were more cattle in Botswana than there were people. But we now know, after only a few years, Botswana is one of the few countries that enjoys a budget surplus, and they are beginning to add value to their diamond. Something is happening in Botswana. Something is happening in Angola. Something is happening in Rwanda. Something is happening in Kenya. Something is happening in Tanzania. Something is happening in Nigeria despite their problems. Something is happening in Ghana. There may be a few flashpoints which we must deal with. The things happening in Cameroon must be dealt with. Those happening in Central African Republic must be dealt with. Those happening in South Sudan must be dealt with. And I'm saying that there is not a civilization that has been spared all those. Africa was organizing great kingdoms when the Europeans were still in caves. We can still do it. And I'm submitting to us that the only way in which we are going to do it is that we must work together. The things that we are talking about will not be achieved in the next 1 year. They may not be achieved in the next 10 years. They may not even be achieved in the next 100 years, but they may very well be achieved even in 10 years. For who knows when the door will give in? Who knows when the tipping point will arrive? And I'm saying that is why the relationship between Africans and the diaspora is very critical. The beauty of men and women in the diaspora is that they have the go-getter spirit. He or she who leaves the continent of Africa to come to the United States of America has a hunting spirit. It is the spirit that propels him or her to go out, because they know that in order to discover new islands, you must lose sight of the shores. And when they have lost sight of those shores, they come here and they receive all else. I listened to a great man saying one thing which I'll repeat to you, that the reason why the ocean never dries out is because the ocean never rejects any river. Any river that flows into her, the ocean receives. But the ocean also churns what she receives. Africa's greatness is that Africa has always accepted every civilization. But the time has come that we must redefine how we deal with this civilization. The new river that is flowing into Africa is a river called China. That river is a river which 30 years ago could not flow. It was a pond. That river is a river that recognized that if you are to lift yourself up, you've got to lift yourself by your bootstraps. Some may say that we don't even have boots, so how can we lift ourselves by the bootstrap? But lift yourself nevertheless. They lifted themselves up and they are now looking at Africa. I do not blame them. I'm saying that there is something to learn from them. There is something to learn from them, and the things to learn from China is the belief that you can do things for yourselves. And I'm saying that we Africans have demonstrated not once, not twice, but times without number, that we have the physical and the intellectual wherewithal to do things for ourselves. We have done it in different parts of the world, and there is no magic. We can still do it. We've got to learn that from the Chinese.
I'm proud to be born in Africa, a land of good leader. Kenyatta, Museveni, Kagame, leaders of the nation. Malema, Lumumba, Ramaphosa, leaders of Africa. Stand up, young people stand up, work up, stand up. Africa, stand up. Don't learn from Africa. Yeah. Stay home, Africa. Oh, say, work up, stand up. Young people stand up. Work up, stand up. Africa, stand up. Don't learn from Africa. Yeah. Stay home, Africa. Oh, yeah, bro.